Tom Campbell here. I and MBT Events hope you like this video. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our Patreon account or through a one-time donation. It would be very much appreciated. The links are in the description below. Thank you.
Hello, Tom. A new project for you. I've got a challenge. My big toe, Tom Campbell's viewpoint, my big toe, Donald Huffman's viewpoint, and my big toe, Bernardo Kastrup's viewpoint. 5 minutes for each subject. You're on.
I don't do anything in 5 minutes, but yeah, all three of us, Bernardo and myself and Donald, we all have toes and theories of everything. We all have perspectives and we all come from a different direction, but all of us agree, all of those would agree that consciousness is fundamental. So we'll all start from that viewpoint, that consciousness is fundamental. But we're all very different too. We're all very different. Now, we could even say that if consciousness is fundamental, that we then live in a virtual reality. Probably all of those people would say, or wouldn't mind me saying that they say that they also think we live in a virtual reality. In the sense of Bernardo, he'd say that in the sense of Plato in a cave, that analogy, that the world we see isn't really the real world, it's just shadows on the wall. Well, it's a virtual world then, so we could call that a virtual reality. It's not, the reality we see is not really the thing, the fundamental thing. So he would agree that we call that a virtual reality, and Huffman would agree too. He says that this physical world is just an interface, just like the computer interface. The real thing going on are those ones and zeros being crunched in a processor someplace, but we can't work with that. We need a much higher level interface with reality. And therefore, what you see is not really what's there. It's a virtual reality. It's something other than what's real. And both of them come to the conclusion that what's really real is consciousness. Okay, so you'd think if we all agree that reality is virtual, and we all agree that consciousness is what's fundamental, then, well, how could we be very different? But we are very different. And it's interesting that each of us has taken on this issue based on our own perspectives. So we have Donald Huffman, who is a neuroscientist, and he also, I think, was into some computer science in his career, but he's a neuroscientist. So he looks at it in terms of perception, okay? Because, a big part of neuroscience is perception. So he looked at it that way, and he says what we perceive is the interface, is this virtual interface. Okay, so he sees things in terms of perception. And Bernardo sees things philosophically. So Bernardo, being a philosopher, among other things, he's a philosopher with some technical background, but a philosopher. And he sees it through the philosophical viewpoint of idealism. Okay, so, that's his approach. And of course, Tom Campbell's a physicist. So, and what did he do in his career? He modeled things in computers. He made computer models. Okay, computer models of hardware and other things, but he modeled reality like physicists. Physicists make models of reality, and it's what they do. They model reality, and their models are usually computer-based. So computer-based models of reality, and I see this as a computer-based model. So each of us kind of has our own way of viewing reality, and we've attacked the problem from our particular viewpoint. So Donald tries to convince his audience of this non-physical consciousness that is really behind everything else, and that this reality is not real, and that this reality is not the real thing. And that's pretty much what he's done, and he's even tried to make some mathematical models of that. Okay. Bernardo kind of ends up, like most philosophers, in idealism, more from a God perspective. God does it all. God's in charge. It's a more religious viewpoint, because if the material world's not material, what's the immaterial world? The immaterial world's the spiritual world, and the spiritual world is kind of leads you to God. You know, it's that kind of thing. So he comes from that perspective, and from that philosophical perspective, he has problems. You know, he mentioned one to me that I was unaware of, actually, as it being a problem. He said that people in idealism, they have one big problem that they have a hard time addressing, and that is, well, if all the world is information, then where's the information? Where is the information? And idealists can't really say where's the information or where it comes from. But if this world is information, if it's thought, if it's idea, then there is no little library in the sky. So that's a problem. But when he told me that, I said, well, that's easy. Of course there's information. There's lots of information, you know, that's all based on information. And there is a database in the sky, if you like. It's not in the sky, but it's part of that consciousness is databases and information. So anyhow, that kind of the differences of where we come from, each one of us kind of comes out of our own career field, if you like, and focuses from that perspective. But I like to go back to the idea that a model, all three of us have models of reality. That a model is not, you know, all models are just models. You don't say this is the model. Well, that would be very arrogant to say that this model is the only model that could possibly exist for all time, because we really don't know all the things we might learn in all time. So all models are just models. And there's only one way to differentiate the value of a model, and that is, how much does it explain? That's the key thing in a model. If a model can explain lots and lots of things, then it's a good model. And if there's some things it can't explain, like where's the information, then it obviously it's not a complete model. It either needs to be tweaked a little bit, or it needs to, you know, change some of its thinking. If a model can answer these questions pretty well, but can't answer those, that just means the model's incomplete. It's not a complete theory of everything, because there's some things it can't explain very well. So the idea, if you want to compare the three of us, we all are good guys. We're all trying the best we can to describe a model that is a theory of everything. And each of the models has its own, you know, following, and its own historical precedents, as well as you know, technical sides to it, and so on. They all three do. So I would say just put them up in a big matrix and say, okay, here's Tom's model, MBT, and, you know, here's Bernardo's model, and here's Donald's model, and then have a whole list of questions they answer, you know, things that they can answer, and just see which model answers most questions. That would be the way to compare them, I guess, the best way to compare them. Because if you try to compare them from an argument viewpoint, I think the arguing would be endless. I don't think that would ever get anywhere. I think models are to be compared by how good they are at explaining the facts, what we know to be facts. Now, from a scientific perspective, facts are things that are determined by experiment. A fact is something that we can do, we can see, we can feel. If I hold a thing up here in the air and I let go of it, the fact that it falls down and not up, that's a fact. Now you have to explain that. Why does it fall down and doesn't fall up? You see, so facts are born out of experimentation. Dropping something, opening my hand and letting a rock go, that's an experiment. And it produces a fact. Things always fall down, never fall up or sideways. So then one has to explain that fact. So you have to see, how does each model explain the facts? And there's not just physical facts like gravity. They're all not physical facts. If they're all just physical facts, then that's basically physics. But there's other kinds of facts as well. There's facts that have to do in the philosophical side. The philosophical side, facts are done with logic. Is something logical? And things can be logical and still be wrong if they don't have good assumptions. If I say, first assumption, Bossy is a cow. Second assumption, all cows can fly. My deduction from that is Bossy can fly. And the logic is perfect. There's nothing wrong with that logic that Bossy can fly, but it's ridiculous because it has an assumption that is not right, which is all cows can fly. So logic, if you have poor assumptions or if you have poor information, leading into that logic, can come out with wrong answers. So you have to have answers that are verifiable and assumptions that are verifiable. So if you're dealing with logic, you have to look at you can't just make things up, stick them in there as assumptions, because what you get out the other end is just more stuff that's just made up. So you have to look at what goes into the logic and what they do with the logic. Those are important. But philosophy tends to want to be logical, or at least reasonable. So let's make this big matrix and see what the differences are. Okay, they all come up with consciousness is fundamental. They're all really idealism. Idealism is that there's something else besides the physical out here that we see that's really behind it all. So they're all really different concepts of idealism. So the big difference is with MBT, you can show why exactly the speed of light's a constant. Okay, because light, you can only move through a matrix, 1 pixel of distance for 1 pixel of time, and you can't get through it any faster than that. That's as fast as you can go through it. All right. So now that requires a virtual reality that's laid out like a matrix, in a grid. Okay. And I don't know whether the other two see their reality as grids or not, but I don't think so. When it comes to quantum physics, you have to be able to explain what is that when the wave function collapses? What really happens there? See, that's a little bit of magic in physics. Well, okay, we have physics and it's all probability, and then the probability wave function collapses to a physical particle. Well, just exactly how does that work? Where does that physical particle just pop into this reality from? How does that, what's the mechanism there? You see, and of course, my MBT says what that is. Well, that's the random draw from the probability distribution of the possibilities. That's what that is. All things are done that way. And the reason they have to be done that way is it's not a bottoms up. We don't start with subatomic to get atomic particles, to get molecules, to get the real world. It's a probabilistic simulation where the rule set generates the probability distributions, and the rule set's mostly deterministic, but it's just the rule set. It's deterministic. It generates the probability distributions, and then the simulation is done as a probability model. So you don't have anything telling you what's going to happen next because you've done it from the bottom up and you know what has to happen next. You don't know what has to happen next, so you have to take a random draw from a probability distribution of the possibilities. in order to determine what happens next. And because this reality is modeled probabilistically, it's rendered as a probability model, then you have to have that way of determining what happens next. So that wave function collapsing is just the rendering engine determining what's going to happen next, or what's going to happen now. What do you get if you make a measurement here? You're going to get a particle, you're not going to get a particle. You see? So the measurement problem then is solved with, that's just the way that a virtual reality that is probability based has to progress. So all virtual realities, all computed realities that are probabilistic have to work with the probabilities of what's going to happen next, how things are going to happen. It's a probability function. So that's just the nature of the way probability works when it comes to using probability to model something else. There's probabilistic models, and there's what we call physics models, which are basically ground up models from particles up. This happens, therefore that has to happen, and that happens, makes the next thing happen, and you work your happening from the bottom up in a physics model. So we've picked those things, and there's just another whole list of things that go on after that. I don't think Bernardo or Donald can explain why the speed of light changes in the eighth decimal place every so often. Well, MBT does. There's the thing called the Xeno Paradox, which happens to be, it was a paradox back in ancient Greece, 500 BC. And what that was, that if you have, you're at A and you want to get to B, and if the way you get to B is that each time you make a jump, you're going to jump halfway there. So the first jump, if it's a mile, then you jump a half a mile. Now it's a half a mile there. The next jump, it's a half a mile. So you make half that distance, and now it's a quarter of a mile, and so on. And the paradox is you can never get there. If you always jump half the distance to your endpoint, you can't ever get there, because that half a distance keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, you see, and you'll never be able to actually get there. And that was a paradox in ancient times, because they thought that the world was continuous. The world's continuous. So you ought to be able to always jump half the distance and jump the next half the distance and jump the half next distance and never, ever arrive, because there'll always be some other distance left and you only get to go half of that, which makes another smaller distance left, but you only get to go half of that. You see the problem, it goes out to infinity and you never can get there. So if you think the world's continuous, then that's a problem. How is it that you can always gain on something but never actually get there? Well, if you realize that the world is digital and comes in pixels, then that's not a problem, because you can't jump between pixels. There is no distance there. You get to this pixel and you get to the next pixel and then the next pixel, and eventually you get to where you're going, always. If you keep taking jumps, if you keep jumping in the right direction, you will always get to where you're going. It may take longer, but you always get there, you see. So basically, that was an ancient Greek thing, and that turned out then to be the name given to a quantum problem, where they had a quantum state, a quantum system that could be in state A or state B, two states. And it generally took, let's say, a minute before it would decay from state A to state B. Okay. Now, if you measured it and found it, okay, it's in state A, and then 10 seconds later, you measure it again, it's still in state A. And 10 seconds later, you measure it again, it's still in state A. And you can do that all day long. For a year, you can measure it every 10 seconds, and it'll never be other than in state A. It never changes. And that was a that was a paradox. Why doesn't it change? Why does your measuring it reset everything? You know, it's like it resets the problem. You go back in time when you made the first measurement or something, because you've been doing it every 10 seconds for a year and it still has never changed to B. So somehow your measurement keeps it from changing. Why is that? Well, when you realize that basically that decay is a probabilistic issue, right? And it takes roughly, say, a minute before there's a 50-50 chance that it'll decay. Well, then when you make the next measurement, you take a random draw from the probability distribution of the possibilities, and 10 seconds later, that random draw is almost always going to give you A, because it's very highly probable that it's still going to be an A and only 10 seconds later, because it usually takes a lot longer than that before it decays. So you're going to get that answer. So it's an A. Then you go measure it again. It's an A. You see, so every time you measurement, it basically resets the clock, and you're taking that random draw. Well, it's only 10 seconds, so it's going to still be an A. Well, it's only 10 seconds. It's still going to be A. And once you understand how that works, then of course, that's how that paradox comes out. So there's all these things, the action at a distance, fields. I do something here and it changes something over there. Well, that's always been kind of magic, right? I take my magnet and I stick this magnet up, and suddenly this piece of metal over here moves to it. There's action at a distance. This magnet over here, without touching that other one, it sucks it right on over some kind of magic way. Well, we made up fields for that. We say, well, there's a magnetic field, and there are electric fields, and there are electromagnetic fields, and these fields have the ability to move things and do stuff and make forces. Well, fields are just mathematics. Fields aren't real. There's no real thing in a field. Physicists have convinced themselves that they're real, but this is just information. In a virtual reality, you compute how things relate to each other. And if you have a magnet, you just compute the force, and the force makes it move. It's just part of an equation. You don't need a field to get it there. So, those kinds of things happen. And there's just lots of other things that MBT has, all these scientific facts that it gets, and it can explain all of them very easily. And there's a whole lot more. We could go on for an hour of all the various facts that MBT can.
Well, from a physicist's point of view, I think it's very interesting. What I do find interesting also between Donald, Bernardo, and yourself is that your perspective is strictly from a physicist's perspective, and Bernardo's from a philosophy, and Donald from computer science and neuroscience. But you're all idealists, and you all recognize. Now, I don't know enough about Donald Huffman's work, but Bernardo, as you said, is coming from the God does it all. Now, what most people don't realize about your theory is that you recognize this larger consciousness system, or you call it the LCS, as the source that Bernardo is speaking of. You don't name it that because yours is a different type of model, but you do recognize it as this larger consciousness source of which we're a part. That kind of connects you.
Yes.
And that I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, one might say that I say that a larger conscious system does it all, and there's just a difference in the name. But there's more difference than just the name. And that is, in my model, the larger conscious system doesn't always exist. We evolve it from a minimalist piece of consciousness. We start with something that only can tell it's in state A or state B. That's all it's aware of. And we let that evolve in a natural way, doing the logic of how would it have to evolve. And then we come up with this larger consciousness system. It isn't perfect. It isn't infinite. It's still a work in progress. It's still evolving. And that's a different thing. And it's got a purpose, and it's got a point, and that is to lower entropy. So see, that gives us a beginning. It gives us a process. It kind of establishes, where does this larger conscious system come from? Well, it evolves. And, where did that one little things come from? Well, we have some conjecture for that, but we don't know that. But then we can't know that because we're consciousness, and we can't get outside of consciousness to see the beginning of what it is we are. You see, that's logically impossible. So we have to accept that as an assumption. Consciousness exists, but we don't let it just pop into existence as everything. See, which God does. God just exists because it does. And as it pops into existence, kind of fully done, complete, and it is everything, period. So this is something that has to evolve. It starts in something tiny, and it evolves, and it goes through all the steps that evolution requires of it to evolve. And that gives us a lot more information than just God does it. That gives us information which says, what's the driving force in this system? Well, it's lowering entropy, because that's how information systems evolve. And it designates this thing not as just some mystical creature, but as an information system, an aware information system, a conscious information system. Okay, it starts as consciousness. So it is imperfect. It doesn't know everything. It's still evolving. It had to learn. It had to go through its own process of trying to figure out, what's right, how to lower entropy, that sort of thing. And it gives us good logical connections to why are we here? Where did the people come from? Why are they logically necessary in this process? Well, my model can say why they're logically necessary. And the model that Bernardo has just says, well, the system wanted some babies. The system needed to entertain itself or needed to do, but it's not as logical. It's just a statement. It's another assumption. As I see it, it's another assumption. So it's not as telling. It also, like I say, says entropy is the driver. So now you have a way to tell right from wrong, good from bad. It's a matter of entropy. That's how you define those things. It explains a lot more about the system rather than just saying, oh, it exists. It's God, it exists, it's always existed, it's infinite and perfect. It's not any of those things. And those have logical consequences. So that's really a difference. One difference between Bernardo and mine is that my system is an evolved system, and there's logical consequences to that evolution. So we can see the markers of where the larger conscious system had to learn that love was the answer. It didn't always know that. And we can see the places where it, was arrogant and it had its issues and had to grow up. And we see records of that. So
you
there's
did some conjecture on the YouTube video we have up called The Origin of Consciousness. That sort of gives your conjecture on how this single cell developed into this larger consciousness system. I think it's very interesting, but I think the work and the decades of research that Donald and Bernardo have done, and they're highly credentialed, brilliant men, along with yours, gives us a lot of hope that we will get to this answer of consciousness is fundamental. And that's really exciting from all these different viewpoints and different experiences.
I think so. I think so too. So I would like to say that, we're different. The three of us are different, but I think those differences are all good. I think all three of us are not only good, but necessary. I think you need to approach the problem from many different ways, because some ways will be better for some people to grasp, and other ways will be better for other people. So we need not only the three of us, but there's probably room for a 4 of us and a 5 of us and a 6 of us. There's room for more. I think that's good, and I think it's necessary. So that's kind of the end thing. But we are different. there are differences, and most of the differences can be derived on what can you explain? What can you explain, say, in a more precise way, as opposed to a more general way? Now, we all can explain, you can explain everything in a very general way by just saying God does it. Well, how does this work? Oh, God does it. What makes trees grow? Oh, God does it. Why does anything work? And God does it. But that's a very general expression. It's not that it's wrong. I'm not saying, oh, that's a wrong answer. I'm just saying that answer doesn't give you very much. It's such a high level answer that it doesn't really give you a lot of logical benefits. It doesn't derive things. It doesn't explain things very well. So we have to look and see how each of the models explain things. If I just said, well, how does this work? Oh, the larger conscious system does it, then that's not helpful. You have to be able to say, why is it that the speed of light changes every once in a while? Why does it do that? And why in the 8th decimal place? Why is it that there's these 5 or 6 cosmological constants that are all tuned to each other, down to the 8th or 9th or 10th decimal place? And if any one of them changed even a tiniest bit in that 10th decimal place, then the whole universe would be unstable and would have never gotten here. It all would have fallen apart. How come these things all got tuned like that? Well, larger conscious system does it. He tuned it. Well, that's an answer, but it's not a good answer. The answer has to be, why did it? Why was that necessary? Logically, why did that have to happen that these things are tuned? What was this virtual reality? Why was it created? Why are people here? Just because God wanted babies? I don't think that's a very good explanation. He wanted little people to deal with. He needed somebody to teach. Who knows? He was bored. Those are all, might be true, but they're at a high level. They don't really tell you specifics of why. I would ask, why do people have to be here? You see, what logic required the people to be here? And I don't think the other 2 models actually come up with that specific logically. Why do humans have to be part of the picture?
You speak a lot.
And why is it, where are we going? What's the point? What's the purpose? And where are we headed? And models don't just happen for no reason. They have to have models. So yes, the source is the source of the model, right? But why? Yeah. Why did the source have to create this model? And we're in this model, and what's our mission? Why are we here in this model? You see, very specifically, not just, because the system wanted to do it.
Your model generates a purpose, and yours is the model that most, as you call them, left brain engineers or as such like that, IT people, most of them really love the logic in your model. And others love Bernardo's philosophy. And others love, Donald Huffman's viewpoint too. We need more people from different disciplines. And we talked about this a long time ago. I think we mentioned at one time Bruce Grayson in the Division of Perceptual Studies. There are many people with decades of research that can contribute to this picture that brings you virtual reality, consciousness is fundamental, and from all of these different viewpoints and experiences. And that is an exciting beginning.
It is. The more people that we're able to convince to become idealists, the better off we're going to be. First, we have to overcome the opposition, which is the materialists. And all 3 of us see that materialism, is a defunct idea. It doesn't work anymore. And I think that's a great step forward. And all 3 of us have our shoulders to that stone, trying to push that a little, further up the hill. And it is an uphill push because materialism is very, very centered, very grounded in our culture. So yes, we're all working together on that. And there's one other area that my model is very precise about, that I don't think the other two even bother to mention, and that is the things that are paranormal. How does remote viewing work? And of course, we can all just say, oh, well, there is no such thing as remote viewing. That's just, people having hallucinations, but that's not true. Remote viewing is a real thing, and so is precognitive dreams, and so are, out-of-body experiences, and so is the seeing of auras, actually all of these things. And there are people who are very good at prognosticating the future, decades at a time. And of course, there's most people who are not very good at it, but there are some people who've done some interesting things that way. So there are paranormal things that happen, and it does exist. And if it exists, then you have to be able to explain it. Why does it happen? What logic of your system drives it and makes it happen? In other words, it's not just that, well, in a model, in just the typical model of idealism, there's nothing really that forces people to be part of it. There's no logic that says that has to happen. It's just a choice. God makes the choice to create people. And then we can guess at what God's motivation was, but guessing God's motivation is probably not a very useful thing to do. But a model needs to be logical, that says people have to show up logically. These paranormal things have to exist. It's not that they just do exist, but they have to exist because of the way the model's made. The wave function collapsing has to collapse. The observer has to be part of it because that's the internal structure of the model requires that. It's not just that the model lets that happen. It's not that the model just lets waves and particles kind of be one way or the other way. This principle of complementarity, they call it. It's not that the system just allows it, but it's logically has to happen that way. Just like the speed of light has to have a cap. It can't go more. It's not that somebody just made that up. It's not that God decided, well, I think the speed of light should be a constant. The internal logic of the model requires that it is a constant in this virtual reality. So that's mostly the differences. But all three of us are really trying to push our culture in a direction away from materialism.
Yes.
And
Well,
we're all doing the best we can to do that.
Absolutely.
So
You teach these things. You're the only physicist I know that teaches remote viewing and out-of-body exploration and all of the things that are paranormal in your classes. And we've put together an audio program from all of the best presentations you've done, and that's at MBT Events, called Exploring Consciousness with Thomas Campbell. You're the only physicist I know who does physics with a logical model and also explores consciousness. And I think your programs have been successful for a lot of people, teaching them how to access that part of them, that consciousness that we're part of. So that is something unique about your model. But all of them, contribute, I think, so much.
I agree. I had a good time talking with Bernardo. I haven't yet talked with Donald Huffman. I see them working with me. I don't see us as in competition. I see them working with me, and we all have our own points and our own ways of explaining things. And each of us probably explains some things, maybe better than the others. But there's differences, and that's good because people have differences, and some people will like one method, they relate to it more than the other.
Well, I'm glad you did this, because a lot of people are saying, oh, wow, Donald Huffman, oh, wow, Bernardo Castro. I love the interview you did with Bernardo. You all have some things in common. And so this is highlighting some of the things and acknowledging them. So this has been fascinating. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's all part of the solution, all of us. And it's not just the three of us. There's tens of thousands of people out there that are being part of the solution. All the people out there who are trying to see bigger pictures. Whether their bigger picture is more or less correct isn't as important as the fact that they are trying to see bigger pictures, trying to help people open their minds. Eventually, people will find what's right, what works for them. And that's good. They should. But I see myself as just one of many that's trying to help people have a bigger picture of the nature of reality and not just get stuck in this very limited material viewpoint.
Well, you have many people who appreciate all of the work you've done, and we thank you.
I and MBT Events hope you liked this video. We will continue to post videos for free on my YouTube channel, but please understand, these videos are expensive to produce. They represent many thousands of hours of production and editing, as well as all the necessary audiovisual equipment, computers, and software. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our Patreon account or through a one-time donation. It would be very much appreciated. The links are in the description below. Thank you.